Okay, I'm David Shea. I'm a professor here at Stanford, and our first session is on consensus. So consensus is the core problem in blockchain, so we're very glad that innovations are continue to happen. Okay, our first speaker for today is Michael Milken from the Technion, and his talk will be on sprints, intermittent blockchain mining. Thank you, Michael.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael. I'm a PhD student at the Technion. Today I'll present Sprints. It's a joint work with Lulu, Itai, and Fan. Sprints is a new type of protocol that is based on standard proof of work with a small twist that miners are forced to mine intermittently. As a result, Sprints is more than 10 times less polluting and more than 50 times more energy efficient than standard proof of work. And it has almost the same security guarantees. So a bit of outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'll talk about why we want to keep proof of work in the first place. Then I'll describe briefly the protocol of Sprints. Then I will justify the reduction of emission that Sprints achieves. I will go over our security proofs, and then finally the implementation and our main results. So why proof of work? Proof of work is a truly decentralized protocol that allows anyone to join the system without going through centralized exchanges or buying coins from miners. If I want to acquire Bitcoin, I can just buy mining rigs and mine my own coins. This concept does not exist in many other protocols. Additionally, we can follow the money and see that Bitcoin and other proof-of-work protocols are still holding the majority of the mining market cap in the world. And also, it is the choice of financial institutions. We can see it in large ETFs that are centered around Bitcoin and large firms such as MicroStrategy and even recently BlackRock. But as you all know, there is a catch that comes with high security. Bitcoin consumes a lot of energy. In fact, Bitcoin consumes more power than a country of 40 million people like Argentina. And as a result, it also emits a lot of CO2 emission and contributes to pollution. And regardless the pollution, it also creates burden on local power systems. And we can see it in what happened in Sichuan, China, where at some point the majority of mining activity in the world were focused, and this was a problem for the local grid. And this led China, one of the reasons that led China to ban crypto mining from its territory. So the most famous alternative for proof of work are the family of protocols called proof of stakes, such as Ethereum 2, Algorand, Ouroboros, etc. They are much more energy efficient than Bitcoin, but they usually require stronger assumptions such as availability of nodes or weak subjectivity and the existence of source of randomness. Additionally, they are inherently less decentralized because new nodes that join the system can be slowed down by existing stakeholders. Also, there is a biasness in the initial coin distribution that can accumulate over time. And finally, the only way to enter the system is through buying coins. So I can get Ethereum mainly by going through centralized exchanges and P2P. And this requires some notion of trust that does not necessarily exist in Bitcoin. Other notable alternatives that focus on energy saving, there are a lot of them, but I will mention 3 here. We have proof of storage, Chia, which is a protocol that uses storage instead of work. But it was shown in the work by Dembo et al. That the threshold for an attack in Chia is 27% versus the 50% in Bitcoin. We also have HEB, which is a work by Tsabari et al. It uses mechanism design in order to reduce the consumption of the system by 2 times, the power consumption, but it additionally reduces immunity to some attacks by more than 2 times. Additionally, we have permission solutions such as Libra and Stellar, but those solutions are centralized and therefore not comparable to standard proof of work. So in this work, our goal is to provide a new protocol that guarantees the same decentralization and security as in standard proof of work protocols, while producing much less CO2 emission. And in fact, when we compare 2 protocols, we want to compare apples to apples and therefore compare the CO2 emission per cost of attack. So a bit about sprints. In sprints, miners mine intermittently, for example, 5% of the time. By forcing miners to mine like this, we shift expenses from power consumption to hardware acquisition. And as a result, the CO2 emission per cost of attack is smaller in sprints than for standard proof of work. For example, if miners are forced to mine only 5% of the time, the emission goes down by 10 times and the power consumption by 15 times. And the way we force miners to stop mining is by using a new type of puzzle called proof of delay. Proof of delay has 3 main requirements. It has to be sequentially computable, efficiently verifiable, and the computation time has to be identical for all the nodes in the system. As for the actual implementation of this puzzle, we can use VDF that inherently fulfills the first 2 requirements. As for the 3rd requirement, we can assume that weak players don't participate in the protocol and exit the system due to economical reasons. This is very similar to the way that CPU miners no longer participate in the Bitcoin protocol because they have no economical incentive to do this. We can think of better constructions that will be closer to a perfect proof of delay. For example, one direction is to use multiple VDFs with different algorithms in parallel. This will allow us to guarantee that it would be much harder for a miner or attacker to get advantage because he will have to have advantage in many different algorithms in order to gain any advantage in the calculation time. But better constructions are out of the scope of this work, and this is an open question that we yet to answer. The sprints timeline looks a bit different than the standard proof of work timeline. For example, assuming 10 minutes block time, the miner would spend most of those 10 minutes in mining proof of delay. Only in the end of the interblock time, the miner would start proof of work mining, and the puzzle will be much easier than the puzzle in Bitcoin. In the bigger picture, we can see that Sprints protocol would look very similar to the standard blockchain of Bitcoin, only that blocks have to consist of 2 puzzles, proof of delay and proof of work. And for a block to be full, it has to have both of those puzzles solved. We call a block that has only proof of delay puzzle a partial block, and it is, of course, not public. So a first thing that can come to your mind when you see sprints is whether miners can break the protocol and use their proof of work mining rigs while they're supposed to wait. And to demonstrate why this won't be helpful for any attack, I will show you an example, but later we will tackle this more formally in the proof part. So let's consider a situation where an attacker has her own branch, and her goal is to make this branch as deep as possible in order to reorg some honest branch. She now calculates the proof of delay that will extend block B1, and she wants to use her proof of work in order to mine on a partial block B1 tag, which is against the protocol. In the best case scenario, she will find immediately the proof of work puzzle. And roughly at the same time, she will have two partial blocks, B2 and B2 tag, which are at the same exactly depth. This didn't help her to achieve a deeper private branch, as if she would not engage in parallel mining, she would be in the same place in terms of depth of her own branch. Again, we will tackle this more formally in a few slides, but first I want to explain why CO2 emission is reduced in sprints. So first we go over intuition. The cost of miners in proof of work consists of two components: OPEX, which is the electricity consumption or ongoing costs, and the CAPEX costs, which are the mainly hardware or the initial investment in equipment, facilities, etc. And let's look at a qualitative example where the costs are split equally between OPEX and CAPEX at Bitcoin, and ask ourselves what will happen when we move to sprints. So in sprints, miners can use their mining equipment only part of the time, and therefore their OPEX costs would go down significantly, and also the total costs in the system will go down. This will create sort of an arbitrage where the profit margin increases and many miners want to buy new mining rigs, and the amount of mining rigs would increase in the system, which would increase the CAPEX component much more than it would increase the OPEX component. So in this specific example, if we assume 5% mining time, the OPEX will be only 5% of the cost and the CAPEX would be 95%. So how do we quantify this? We compare the emission between sprints and Bitcoin, and we assume they both have identical total income and identical profit margins. Of course, this results in also identical total costs, and now we can use existing numbers about total electricity consumption of Bitcoin and the average electricity price in order to estimate the OPEX costs for miners in Bitcoin. We then use this to estimate the CAPEX cost, and finally we can compare to sprints where we have equal costs and estimate the OPEX and CAPEX costs for sprints and the number of rigs which was increased. Now when we have all of those numbers, we can get the total emission. We use existing work that also consider the emission caused by the hardware life cycle, for example, production and the hardware disposal. And also, of course, we include the electricity from the OPEX consumption. The results we get is that are in this graph. The x-axis here is the portion of time we do proof of work mining, when one is just the standard Bitcoin. And the y-axis is the normalized emission, when one is the emission of Bitcoin. We can see that the emission indeed decreases very fast when we reduce the portion of time we engage in proof of work. And we'll come back to this graph in the end when we'll add a bit more data to it regarding the security threshold. So the main part of this work was the security proof. And in order to prove that sprints is secure, we had to prove two properties: persistence and progress. In very high level, persistent means that with high probability, once a block is in the main chain, and it has enough confirmation, it will stay there forever. And progress, which is often called liveness in previous work, says that with high probability, in the long enough period, at least a single honest block added to the main chain and stays there forever. So our objective is to prove that both properties hold in sprints for propagation delay 0. We could not use existing methods for analysis of security in Bitcoin. This is because sprints is not memoryless, meaning the probability of finding a block changes throughout the interblock time. And therefore, we had to think about a new methodology. So our methodology is a generalization of the standard analysis because it works also for standard proof of work. Similar to work by Dembo et al., we also identify the worst possible attack, but we do it slightly differently. We reduce the game to much simpler races in order to be able to estimate the probability of persistent violation using existing methods. So, as I said, we want to bound the probability of persistence and progress violation, and for this we break the problem into smaller subproblems. So we think about violation of K persistence at depth D as an event that happens in an execution where at some time T1 we have block B at depth D that has K confirmations. And then at some time T2 that is greater than T1, this block ends up not being in the main chain or being reorged. We can further break down this to violation of K persistence at depth D for subtree I. And subtree I means the subtree that begins at the common ancestor, that its first common ancestor with B is at depth I. And then we can consider an attacker that tries to attack only using one of those subtrees. So why is it helpful for us? We can use union bound. So the probability of any violation is smaller or equal than the sum of all possible probabilities for all possible violations for every possible D and every possible TI. And if we can manage to bound this sum, we will bound also the probability for violation of persistence. And in fact, we show that this sum is negligible in K for a minority attacker. And the way we do it, we simplify the game to a simpler race. We have a race where the initial state is G, which is the genesis block, which corresponds to the common ancestor we saw earlier. And we have two branches, the attacker private branch and the honest public branch. The attacker's private branch is not being published at all. This is a simplification for the game when we justify this. And the honest branch is always public. Of course, the attacker can also mine on the honest branch, but she has to publish the blocks. And the game ends when two conditions are met. The attacker's branch is at least as deep as the honest branch, and both are at least K tag blocks deep. In order to bound the probability of attacker winning in the game, we define the notion of optimal strategies. We have an optimal strategy, which basically means that for all L and T, it maximizes the probability that the attacker branch is deeper than L at time T. And the maliciously optimal strategy does the same, only with minimization of probability that TH is deeper than L. We find two of those, two such strategies. That the first one is the longest chain mining with interruption that is optimal on TA, which basically means that the attacker doesn't do parallel mining. She only mines on the deepest block, and when she calculates the proof of delay, she rests, like the protocol is supposed to say. So we prove that this is indeed an optimal strategy. As for the maliciously optimal strategy, this is just no mining at all on the honest branch. Although it sounds trivial, in fact, both proofs were quite complicated, and we used double induction in order to prove it. And finally, because we simplified the game, we can now reduce the race to a case where, for standard proof of work, where there is no TPOD. And then we can use standard tools such as random walk in order to bound the probability of attacker success. And we show that the sum I showed you earlier is negligible for a minority attacker. This allows us to conclude that persistence holds. The proof for progress is quite similar, but I won't go into details because of shortness of time. And finally, we wanted to implement sprints One of the main questions we wanted to answer is how sprints acts in terms of security when we allow propagation delay. So the problem is that in sprints, if we consider the same interblock time of 10 minutes, the proof of work puzzle is much shorter. And therefore, we have higher probability for forks. So we wanted to estimate this fork rate using implementation. We took the standard Bitcoin client and forked it. We created a network of 100 nodes running on a single machine. We used random topology in order to connect them, and we emulated latency using OS tools. As for POD, we used VDF construction by Veselovsky, and the difficulty adjustment was also tweaked to include the second moments in order to estimate both proof of delay and proof of work time. So this is the main result of our work. We saw earlier the effect of rho on the emission. We can see here that the attack threshold in Bitcoin, the effective attack threshold, including the fork rate, is very close to 0.5 as long as rho is not too small. And kind of a sweet spot here before the threshold goes down very fast is around 5% mining rate, which leads to 49% effective attack threshold. And the emission, as I said, is reduced by more than 10 times. So conclusion, Sprints is a new type of protocol that includes hybrid proof of delay and proof of work. It shifts costs from OPEX to CAPEX. It introduces ecological benefit by reducing the emission by more than 10 times. And it only brings slight reduction in the security threshold from 50% to 49%. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Michael? Yeah.
There is a microphone there.
So I have two questions. Maybe they are related. So first one is what went wrong if you just use proof of delay for consensus without the proof of work part. The second one is what's the trade-off of choosing the mining rate? You choose 5%. What if you choose 1% or 50%?
Okay. Thank you very much. The first question is a very good question, and one thing I have to emphasize is that the proof of work here is a crucial part of the protocol because it allows us to, if we would use only proof of delay, we would not have a way to judge which miner invests more into the system, and therefore we would have not have the principle of one CPU, one vote that we have in proof of work. So the proof of work is a very important part here. And additionally, we need the miners to spend some resources in real world. And the proof of work is the way they spend resources. So they still spend electricity, but much less in sprints than in standard proof of work. Instead, they buy more mining equipment. The second question, I think it can be answered in this graph. When we reduce rho too much, the effective fork rate also increases significantly, and therefore the security reduces. So what I showed you is the sweet spot where the security is still good, but we reduce a lot of emission.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying that the security threshold is a function of that percentage of allocated to mining. Is that correct? Oh, yes. I see. Okay.
Yes.
So is this curve like optimal curve or is it an achievable curve?
This is from experiment. You mean the blue curve, right?
Oh, I thought the blue curve has a theorem behind it.
As a what?
Maybe I'm confused. So your security theorem, so to connect to that question, so there's a parameter here, right, which is the percentage of time you allocated to mining, I think the question was, should it be 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%? In fact,
Yeah.
extreme case would be 0%, right? So that parameter enters into the security threshold. Is that the theorem or?
The theorem only dealt with the case where delta equals 0, so we don't have forks at all, okay?
Okay.
And we estimated the fork rate using experiments.
I see. Okay. Got it. All right. We have a question there.
Thanks for the talk. Giulia Scaffino from Technical University of Vienna. I was wondering, so you said you have persistence with minority adversarial power, but we know that Bitcoin, for instance, suffers from selfish mining, so with attacks from a minority of adversaries. Does your protocol also suffer from selfish mining, or do you have any improvement on that?
So selfish mining requires a different model, okay? We have to consider incentives. And this was outside of the scope of this work because it was not trivial to use the same tools that were used for analyzing selfish mining to analyze the selfish mining here, because the block creation rate is much more complicated. As you remember, the standard selfish mining analysis uses Markov chains, and here the process is not Markovian. So this is something for future work, but it's a very interesting question.
Thanks.
Okay. Is there any more question? Okay, please.
So I think on one of your first slides, you said that there was a 10 times reduction in emissions and I think a 15 times reduction in power usage. And I was a bit confused as to why those two numbers are different. It seems to me that if you have all of the power usage sort of is the product of some amount of emissions from the power that's, from coal perhaps that's burned to generate the power to power the network that way. How can there be a difference between the power reduction and the emission reduction?
Okay, so this is a very good question. As I said during the slide, when we consider sprints, miners would increase the number of mining rigs they have, right? Because now their costs are reduced and they will buy more mining rigs. As a result, we have pollution that comes from the production of those mining rigs, which we included in our analysis.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So one more question, and then we will start the next talk.
Yeah, you talked about how the energy consumption can be a stress on electric networks in countries where mining happens. Wouldn't the intermittence induced by sprints be even more of a problem for those power grids?
Why is it more problem?
Well, mainly because electricity production has kind of a high inertia, and it's very hard for...
As high, sorry?
As a high inertia, and it's very hard for the power grids to regulate themselves if there is a very high demand and then a very low demand and then a very high demand.
Okay. Okay, this is a good question. Again, this is very right consideration. We don't deal with it directly in the paper, but I will just say that in reality, electricity companies have a component for incentivize consumers that don't need a constant electricity supply to use electricity when the demand is low. Okay, so in this case, those consumers will equalize the total demand. Additionally, this is something we mentioned in the paper, power companies often overcharge you for the maximum demand you had during a period of time, okay? So it's not only about how much electricity you consume in total, but it's also they look at the maximum. And this would be actually beneficial for sprints because it would increase the total costs of miners in sprints and will further reduce the electricity consumption and the emission.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much again, Michael. Okay. All right. Well, we're setting up. Okay. So the second speaker of the session is Peiyao Shen from Urbana-Champaign. Yes, Urbana-Champaign?
Yeah.
Okay. And the talk will be on Trust Boost.
Thanks, David, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to introduce you our work, Trust Boost, about boosting trust among interoperable blockchains. This is a joint work with Xuechao, Kartik, Shiram, and Pramod. So in recent years, we've witnessed an explosive growth in blockchain arena. Thousands of distinct layer 1 blockchains have sprung up, each with their own security protocols and functionalities. And significantly, there existed marked disparity in their security measures of these protocols. Some blockchains bolstered by extensive activity, substantial stakes, or if it's proof of stake, hash rate is robust, they exemplify strong security mechanisms. Conversely, others with diminished activity may inherently face higher vulnerabilities when they are under adversarial actions. So this scenario raises an imperative question that how can these less secure blockchains boost their security? And furthermore, as this ecosystem continues to evolve, we observe a trend towards interoperability. And cross-chain bridges platforms are gaining traction these days, granting users greater flexibility to move their funds and leverage different strengths of different blockchains. But this interconnection also introduces systemic vulnerabilities. To illustrate, let's consider a simple example for cross-chain token exchange between two chains, for example, the Binance and Ethereum. So we know to initiate the exchange, the tokens on one chain are first logged in a smart contract. Then the proof of this action is passed through the bridge and catalyzes the creation of some form of wrap token on the other chain, which are subsequently used to exchange for another token, for example, ETH. And the fairness of this operation relies on the critical assumption that both chains command equivalent trust. But if one of the chains is less secure and is compromised after the exchange, the transaction used for initial lockup of the token on the first chain could be potentially reverted, allowing for those adversarial users essentially claim ETH without any cost. Therefore, things are even worse here because the security breach in one blockchain is not just confined in a single chain. And due to this interconnected framework, the attack can cascade through affecting all the states involved in the same cross-chain application, even if they're stored in a more secure blockchain. So in face of this problem, there's some popular strategy for those weak chains to attain the desired level of security. So one of them is to borrow trust from a more established, more secure blockchain. This borrowing can manifest in various forms, such as being a sidechain of some main chain, or periodically checkpointing their states. However, this method leads to a one-way transfer of those trust from a stronger chain to a weak chain. And in exchange for this trust, these weaker chains give up a portion of their individual sovereignty, since they're bound to the regulations and rules to those secure chains, and their influences to the final consensus has been completely diminished. But what we want to circumvent, if we want to circumvent these limitations, we have to ask a pressing question, which is also the focus of this talk. Without leaning on any highly secured blockchain, how might those weaker chains to band together and create a combined ledger that is robust in its security? And to be more aggressive, at the heart of a good solution we want should be adaptivity. That is, this trust-boosting operation should be ideally lightweight, implemented through smart contracts so that any programmable blockchain can adopt this method. Also, this will allow those constituted blockchains to collaboratively construct and enhance the consensus without altering their own consensus layer. Moreover, the protocol ought to be highly customizable, allowing those participants to tailor their trust need. And for example, if you have a high-value transaction, you may need higher levels of security. And while this might result in some escalated fees or latency, but the trade-off will ensure that your transaction get protected. Then to answer this question, that whether such trust-boosting operation is even possible, we started with a scenario where there exists M equally secure blockchains, among which up to F are considered faulty, meaning that their security and liveness could be compromised. And the symmetricity of this framework implies that the previous solution about simply borrowing trust from a more secure chain no longer works, since there's no a strictly more secure chain. So we must find a new way to combine these ledgers to reach consensus and provide better guarantees. And let's simplify the understanding of this multi-chain framework by drawing parallels with the classic shared memory model. In shared memory model, here the blockchain clients are akin to the processes in shared memory model. These are the active entities that execute actions to trigger the process. And the blockchain ledgers, which store the transactional data and the states, correspond to the shared objects. And it provides two interfaces to the processes. The process can modify the states on the shared objects by submitting a transaction, and also access the status of the transaction by calling the check operation. Once a submitted transaction is committed, the interface will return true. Moreover, to capture the blockchain interoperability, we introduce a vital addition, a cross-chain communication primitive. This primitive models the authenticated communication channel enabled by those cross-chain bridges over the shared objects. And this integration also results in an innovative model that adds the message passing operation on top of shared memory model. So those objects can also actively communicate with each other. And there are also two interfaces for sending messages and deliver. If the message is sent by non-faulty objects, it is guaranteed to be delivered to the destination. Now, here are the two primitives we can use. And in practice, there are various CCC protocols, such as IBC in Cosmos system, and XCM in Polkadot, and CCIP in Chainlink. And different blockchains may use different protocols. You can use proof-of-stake protocols or permissioned BFT protocols, as long as they are compatible with the cross-chain primitives. Okay, so utilizing the tools at our disposal, let's dive into how the TrustBoost protocol works. Now consider we have an application contract that manages the NAM services. And we are going to use TrustBoost to upgrade it to a cross-chain version of contract that with a higher security. On the left is a single chain case. When we say a client wants to register NAM, it simply uses the submit interface and waits for a transaction to be committed. Then in the cross-chain case, from the client's perspective, TrustBoost provides exactly the same interface as any single chain. So clients don't need to worry about how to submit the transactions. And the protocol will coordinate those interactions among different blockchains by transmitting messages through the communication channel. And on each blockchain, we will deploy two types of contracts. The first is a cross-chain version of the application contract. In fact, we just need to add a few lines on top of the original contract to turn it into a cross-chain version contract. And the other is the TrustBoost contract that actually implements the consensus protocol that we are using to build trust. And then the messages can exchange according to how the TrustBoost protocol speculates the behavior. For example, if we use some leader-based BFT protocol, it's possible that the message will be sent to some leader chain and then dispersed to other chains for several rounds of voting for consensus. So this is the overall workflow of how Trust Boost works. And informally, analogies between the blockchains with CCC primitive and the objects with authenticated channels can imply the boosted security of the combined ledger. Because first, we observe that each blockchain behaves the same as a single object. For instance, using some quorum-based BFT protocols, blockchains with super honest majority will not equivocate, and they will execute the contract by its logic. So it behaved honestly. And with faulty blockchains, they can behave arbitrarily, such as equivocating, sending different messages. And we also observed that the communication channel, the cross-chain bridges provides the communication channel for reliable delivery or message authentication. But for different consensus protocol, the cross-chain bridges might be designed in a different way. If the protocol uses signatures, then it can generate some form of proof of commitment. And this proof of commitment can serve as the signature. But if the local consensus cannot provide finality, then the cross-chain bridge may need to rely on the like clients to verify the states of the ledger. And in this way, we see the consensus over those blockchains is achieved the same way as consensus over objects. So we can instantiate Trust Boost with those BFT protocols to securely construct the ledger. So far, we have demonstrated the idea about how to build consensus on top of a group of weak blockchains. But what does it take to implement such a system in practice? In fact, the Trust Boost framework is motivated by some practical considerations, especially the Cosmos ecosystem. So to test the practicality, we also built and deployed the system on top of the Cosmos chain. And just to briefly introduce, Cosmos is a platform that aims to build a decentralized network for interoperable blockchains. So they provide the Cosmos SDK for you to easily build your own blockchains. And also these blockchains are natively support cross-chain communications through a protocol called IBC protocol. Now one might think, because we have such an interoperable and programmable platform, surely it would be relatively straightforward to implement Trust Boost ideas. But here actually lies the crux of our challenges. There are several significant hurdles that differentiate a feasible solution in practice from a mere theoretical result. The first one is that we noticed that the native consensus protocol used in Cosmos chain is Tendermint, which provides us the signature. So it will generate proof of commitment that consists of a set of signatures. And IBC packets will also include this information. This is good because it's like a signature. If two chains want to communicate, they can send a message and attach this as an authentication. Just like two nodes, they want to communicate, they will sign the message. But the issue is this information cannot be accessed by smart contract directly, because the IBC lies in the transport layer, and they will process this message and remove the information at their protocol. So it's internal states. In other words, the information will be dropped before reaching to the smart contract layer. So as a result, we've leaned into adopting the protocol without using the public key information. And our choice is a state-of-the-art partial synchronous BFT protocol known as information theoretic hot stuff. It provides us several good properties like optimistic responsiveness, and it also requires only constant persistent storage. So the Trust Boost is based on top of that protocol. Additionally, we also see smart contract programming has its limitation. It's not designed for implementing such protocols to reach consensus. So, for example, it's inherently single-threaded, and there's no scheme to automatically trigger the timeout. And to address these practical concerns, we established some external bots to regularly ping the blockchains, triggering the necessary behaviors like timeouts as needed, and importantly, we make no trust assumptions on them. They can be replaced by any third-party keeper services with proper incentives. So then we conducted experiments on a group of local chains on the AWS instances. Essentially, our goal was to understand what is the trade-off between the security and the cost, as well as how TrustBoost scales in the performance. By comparing these evaluation results, running on various number of local chains to a single chain execution, we found the number of IBC messages and the gas cost scaled quadratically. This is as expected because the protocol we implement, the IT hostOff itself, has quadratic communication complexity. And in terms of cost, we evaluate that the gas used for 10 chains was roughly between $2 to $10. And this is calculated based on the gas price and the exchange rate at the time of running experiments. And this cost is acceptable compared to those highly secure chains like Ethereum and Bitcoin. Then, based on these results, we also identify some techniques that we can use to reduce the overhead. First, note that the gas usage essentially comes from two sources. The first is the application contract, and another is the TrustBoost contract. While the application contract, the cost is unavoidable because we are using the replication in exchange for trust. So they have to be replicated on different chains. But the cost of TrustBoost contract can be amortized by batching across different applications. Additionally, the performance of TrustBoost is constrained by the efficiency of the IBC protocol. So enhancing the transmission of these cross-chain messages will greatly improve the performance. And after evaluating this practical aspect of TrustBoost, we can identify several application scenarios. One direct application is using TrustBoost to create checkpoints for these constituted blockchains as well as other weaker blockchains, because now we construct a stronger chains ourselves. And by requiring these validators to regularly submit block hashes and checkpoints to the combined ledger, the finality rule should be changed accordingly. And another potential application is the cross-chain token transfer we've just mentioned at the beginning. Because in the beginning, we just say the token transfer is not fair if one chain has less secure. Then now we can ask the other chain to use the TrustBoost to lock the token. Then the stronger chain with the higher security level can only trust the token lock proof from this combined ledger and participate in this fair exchange without compromising security. And one last point I want to discuss is, having just explored how we construct TrustBoost using the cross-chain bridges, it naturally prompts to ask another question: that is this primitive always necessary? Or because some chains may not support those interoperability, or the chains may not compatible to all the chains. So imagine another setting without this communication protocol. This is what we termed as passive mode. So correspondingly, the previous interoperable word is called active mode. And unlike this active mode, here blockchains don't communicate, and processes can only make lazy observations from those objects. Because essentially we can observe that if they can submit any arbitrary transactions, they can turn the passive mode to an active mode. So here we remove the submit interface or we open the submit interface only to those native transactions to local chains. And also those processes are not allowed to forward messages. Exploring such settings also unveils some insights to the trust boost problem, because we found that in passive mode, we cannot achieve consensus, or consensus is impossible in the presence of even a single faulty ledger. And the proof idea mirrors the finding of the FLP impossibility, emphasizing that even a single equivocating chain can cause conflicting outputs. While this consensus might be out of reach, we are not completely in the dark, so there's still room to construct a ledger with a relaxed version of consensus. This relaxation is based on the observation and understanding that the adversarial nodes is not necessary to enjoy those guarantees. If they indulge in double signing tactics, then it's acceptable that their transactions are not accepted and their funds could be lost. So this approach might not offer us total ordering, but is still promising to construct applications like payment systems. And so we proposed another protocol called Trust Boost Lite, tailored for this passive mode. It constructs a weak combined ledger and can be used to develop the applications like a more secure payment chains on top of these weak blockchains. And in conclusion, the primary object of this work was to construct a blockchain with stronger security guarantees by leveraging a group of blockchains with weaker guarantees. And we started this problem by establishing an extended model which better fits the current interoperable and the programmable blockchain network. And on top of which, we first approached this problem from the theoretical perspective, discovering all the necessary primitives needed to construct the solution. And later, we can implement Trust Boost as a proxy contract in a very lightweight way on top of the Cosmos ecosystem so that it can achieve higher security for those applications with a reasonable cost. And moving forward, there are several interesting directions to improve the practicality of this method. We can, for example, we can further extend the protocol to support unequal weights of boosting. For example, recently, there's a recent paper from David's group. They also explored this idea to generalize the checkpointing, and they can explicitly measure the security of proof-of-stake chains to combine their security. And improving the efficiency of cross-chain bridges is also an active area. We can also explore the possibility to design new types of BFT protocols, focuses on improving their efficiency for smart contract programming. For example, reduce the cross-chain messages and the network connectivity to reduce the requirements for those interoperability. Okay, so that's it, and thanks very much for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, question?
Hello. The hot stuff that you're implementing on top, the information theoretic hot stuff, this is a partially synchronous protocol, so it requires this large upper bound delta network delay to work after GST. So what value did you use there in your deployment, and how did you calculate that?
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence?
Yes. So what delta did you use for your maximum delay in your information theoretic hot stuff when you deployed it on top of Trust Boost, and how did you calculate this value?
So we will because we just deployed the local blockchains within a single service. So we used a network delay measured in a single computer service. And and this is for when communicating with the IBC messages, there's also a delay in terms of the system, the protocol designed for the IBC protocol. So this will consider both effects from the initial network delay and the protocol delay, because this is not just a simple network latency.
Thank you.
Okay, next.
Hi, EJ Zhang from University of San Francisco. I'm wondering actually if we could use this to prevent NFT being sold on multiple chains, like one legit chain selling one NFT and a knockoff being sold in another chain, and maybe that could be a good comment. But my actual question is that underlying assumption is that the blockchains that you're using have independent failure kind of model, that their failure should not be connected. There shouldn't be like a one massive avalanche that can kill all those blockchain safety. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that independence assumption, because I think one of the very common practice is that the secondary tokens will be issued on the staked token for liquidity, and that being used for the staking on another chain. That kind of undermines the whole independence of this POS-based consensus security. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
So if I understand correctly, the question is how to compare different, the independent security levels of different chains.
More like, what do you think can undermine the independence assumption of the failure, or what can actually strengthen the independence assumption?
So the independent assumption of different chains.
Right, their failure have to be independent too.
Yeah, their failures are independent, and so if we consider they just for their economic profits to violate different security of blockchains, then it can be considered that if for different chains, they will evaluate the cost to compromise different blockchains. So even if they are violated independently, we can have some attacks that are across different blockchains.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think adding to that point, I think one issue is that in the Cosmos ecosystem, for example, the same validator actually runs validated nodes on many of these chains. So the correlation is indeed a potential issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, next. Maybe it's good to keep the question a little bit short because we have a bunch of questions here.
Sure. So in one of your slides, you claim the challenge of the security breach cascade through the blockchain, right? So your example said the cross-chain domino effect, the reorg from like one chain and the result into the security breach in another chain. But to me, it seems like it's a design problem of the bridge, not really the problem of the other blockchain. The bridge design, they should consider the reorganization of the blockchain in order to pass the message to another chain. So why you think that's the security breach cascade to another blockchain? I don't really get that example. Do you have other example to showcase the cross-chain security cascade problem?
Yeah, so here we are discussing this example in the assumption that breach is optimal. So if the breach, the responsibility of the breach is just to observe that whether some states has been committed on one chain and pass this information to the other chain. And here we want to emphasize is that if two chains have different security levels, then the higher security chains, the states should be protected by the higher security level. But because of this cross-chain application, it actually is downgraded to the lower one because the states, they are connected by the bridge. So if one state is reverted, it got forked, it will affect the other security on the higher security chain. So the security level will be downgraded if they are connected by inside the same cross-chain application, even if the bridge is optimal.
Okay, one quick last question, and then we'll move on.
Great, thank you. So, longtime Cosmos contributor. I know a lot of us were very excited by this work, so it's really nice to see it here. And we had discussed some similar like Tendermint over IPC for a long, long time. kind of a practical question. When implementing something like this, you're going to kind of want to do something with this meta consensus protocol. Namely, you're going to want to have nominate which chains are eligible to participate, change the validator set, and potentially change the protocol itself. Wonder if you'd put any thought into kind of how something like that might work, or just any of those practical considerations.
Yeah, so here we built this because we built the protocol completely on top of the blockchain as a smart contract. So it will change the consensus layer only if you want to change your consensus protocol to, for example, affect the checkpointing finality rule. But if it's just specific for some applications, then it can be really small. The changes don't need to apply to the entire system.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Peiyao.
Thank you.
Great work, great work. Okay. All right, so yesterday we had Goldfish. Today we have another piece of work, continually improving the consensus, Ethereum consensus protocol. Today's speaker is Luca Zanolini, who is going to talk about latest message-driven Ghost.
Hi everyone, I'm Luca Zanolini. It's a pleasure to be here. Today I will present you our joint work with Francesco D'Amato on recent latest message-driven Ghost, or RLMD Ghost. In this work, we devise a synchronous consensus protocol that supports dynamic participation and that can be thought as a potential replacement for LMD Ghost, the component of Gasper that handles dynamic participation. A key observation is that these consensus protocols that support dynamic participation is that they do not tolerate network partitions or asynchronous periods. And because of that, in case of an unexpected periods of asynchrony, they might lose safety, and safety cannot be guaranteed, and blocks confirmed during synchrony could be reorged, for example. We were driven by this observation, and we devised our LMD Ghost, having in mind this idea of potentially tolerating bounded periods of asynchrony. But let's start with some background, and I would like to start with the Sleepy model. Recently, dynamic participation became a key requirement for devising a specific class of permissionless consensus protocol, as dynamic participation enables a system of tolerating participants going offline or coming back online and go back to participate into the protocol. In other terms, where participation among participants is dynamic. The very first permissionless consensus protocol working under dynamic participation is the Bitcoin consensus protocol, but the first formalization in the context of distributed system is by Pass and Xi with the Sleepy model of consensus. In this model, which is a synchronous model, the execution proceeds in rounds, and in each round we have participants that can be online or offline, and they either participate in the protocol or they do not participate in the protocol. We have the requirement that in every round, the majority of the participants that are online is honest. We say that a consensus protocol in the Sleepy model is dynamically available. So we refer to dynamically available consensus protocols that work in the Sleepy model. A problem with these consensus protocols, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that from the CAP theorem, we know that these dynamically available protocols, they do not tolerate network partitions. In other terms, they must be synchronous. This means that it doesn't exist. It cannot exist one consensus protocol that outputs one chain at every well-behaved participant that is both dynamically available and that can guarantee transaction finality in case of network partitions. As a potential, to potentially overcome this impossibility result, Noi, Tas, and Tse device introduced this ebb and flow family of protocols. An ebb and flow protocol is a consensus protocol that is made by two components or two consensus protocols, each one with its own confirmation rule, each one outputting a chain. One of these protocols is a synchronous dynamically available consensus protocol, and that outputs an available chain that is safe and live under synchrony, and a partially synchronous component or a partially synchronous protocol for finality that has the role of finalizing blocks on this available chain output by the dynamically available consensus protocol. Interestingly, the protocol, Gasper protocol, the protocol currently implemented in Ethereum, can be seen as having a structure like an ebb and flow protocol, where LMD Ghost can be thought as the synchronous component, as the synchronous dynamically available component, while Casper can be thought as a partially synchronous component for finality. Now, there are next to dynamically available component that put a question mark. The reason will become clear soon. But let's first review LMD Ghost, seeing that our protocol will build on top of it. And once we understand the structure of LMD Ghost, we will also understand the structure of our LMD Ghost, our protocol. LMD Ghost is a synchronous protocol that proceeds in slots of 2 delta rounds, or as it is currently implemented with 3 delta rounds, where delta is the assumed network delay. 32 slots define an epoch. We have n validators. Every validator has a stake. The set of validator is partitioned in disjoint committees, 1 committee per slot. In each slot as a proposer, randomly picked from the committee, which has the role of proposing a block at the beginning of the slot. All the other validators within the committee vote for a block, optimistically for the block that has already been proposed. LMD Ghost is equipped with a fork choice function. This is a deterministic function that is locally computed by every validator by feeding the set of all the messages that have been received up until that point, like votes and blocks, etc., and that it outputs a canonical chain, which is local for every validator. So, for example, if the proposer evaluates the fork choice function, he will append a new block on the tip of this canonical chain, while all the voters, all the other validators, by evaluating the fork choice function, optimistically they will cast a vote on the block that has been just proposed on top of the tip of the canonical chain. In the case of LMD Ghost, the fork choice function is LMD Ghost fork choice function with originally how it works. It starts from the genesis block, it goes through the block tree, and it chooses as the next block, as the next block, the child with the heaviest subtree, where with the heaviest subtree we mean with the most stake-weighted latest votes on its descendant. Observe that this is not actually the fork choice function that is currently implemented within Ethereum. This is a sort of vanilla fork choice function. The reason for that is that what is currently implemented has also to cope with the influence that Casper has on the protocol, but for the purpose of this presentation, we can just stick with this vanilla fork choice function. The problem with LMD Ghost is that actually is not dynamically available. And the reason for that, I will not go too much into details, but the reason for that is that during the years, some attacks have been discovered against its safety. For example, some reorgs attacks or some balancing attacks have been discovered that prevented either liveness or safety. So for this reason, LMD Ghost is not dynamically available. As Joachim presented yesterday, Goldfish came as a potential substitute for LMD Ghost in the sense that Goldfish is actually a dynamically available consensus protocol that has a structure very similar to LMD Ghost in the sense that it proceeds in slots, in rounds. Every slot is made by 3 delta rounds, and it also has committees in every slot where there is a proposer, there are voters, so the structure is very similar, but it introduces two novel techniques. One is the view merge technique that enables the coordination between the view of the proposer with the views of the voters, so that in this case we can prevent, for example, a balancing attack, because now the voter, before casting a vote, they have to synchronize their local view, their local set of messages that they've received up to that point, with the view of the proposer. So optimistically, under synchrony, this view of the proposer will be a superset of the view of each voter, and they will cast a vote on the block that has been proposed. Moreover, Goldfish introduces a novel technique called vote expiry, where only votes cast in slot T-1 influence the protocol behavior. Here we diverge from the idea of LMD Ghost, where we consider all the messages that have ever been cast from the beginning of time up until slot T, but we only consider votes cast in slot T-1. They prove that view merge together with vote expiry imply reorg resilience, which implies dynamic availability. So here Goldfish can be considered as a potential replacement for LMD Ghost, in the sense that it doesn't suffer the problems that LMD Ghost suffers, and it also brings this dynamic availability that then, combined with a partially synchronous gadget, can result in a ebb and flow, secure ebb and flow protocol. As I mentioned at the beginning, the problem with these synchronous protocols is that they do not tolerate any sort of asynchrony, in the sense that if an unexpected period of asynchrony or network partition comes, these protocols might lose safety under these periods of asynchrony. And for example, in the case of Goldfish, even theoretically, even a single slot of asynchrony, where with asynchrony we mean that we cannot guarantee any message delivery within the delta bound, even one slot of asynchrony could potentially lead to a failure by a malicious proposer could potentially reorg the chain by losing safety of all the previously confirmed blocks. So we ask, can we devise a consensus protocol that can, in some sense, guarantee and tolerate some sort notion of safety in case of unbounded period, or in case of unexpected periods of asynchrony? And here it's what we devise. We devise our LMD Ghost, which builds on top of both LMD Ghost and Goldfish, in the sense that it inherits both techniques from both LMD Ghost and Goldfish, which has a very similar structure to LMD Ghost. So here I will just go a bit faster because it's exactly the structure that I mentioned before. So it is a synchronous protocol. It proceeds in slot, each slot of 3 delta rounds, exactly as Goldfish, if we don't consider the fast confirmation variant of Goldfish. We have N validators. Here we diverge from both Goldfish and LMD Ghost in the sense that we do not consider committees, in the sense that in every slot, the whole set of validators votes, and this, as we prove in the paper, is required in order to prevent some sort of attacks that instead can happen if we have committees with an expiration period that is longer than one slot. Each slot, again, has a proposer that is chosen by the set of validators and that proposes a block at the beginning of the slot. All the active validators, again, vote for a block, optimistically for the block that has already been proposed. We introduced the view merge technique, that is the technique that has been adopted in Goldfish to prevent some sort of attacks. We parameterize our protocol with an expiration period of eta. This means that we extend and generalize the notion of expiration period introduced by Goldfish by extending this period of expiration of messages up to eta slots. This means that only the latest votes cast from slot T minus eta up to T minus 1 influence the protocol behavior. And this, as I mentioned, extends and generalizes LMD Ghost and Goldfish. LMD Ghost is also equipped with a fork trace function, which works very similarly to how it works also in LMD Ghost and Goldfish, with the difference that here we, at every slot, what we consider only the latest votes cast from slot t minus eta up to t minus 1, meaning that only the latest votes cast by validators within this range influence the protocol behavior. And of course, also equivocation are not considered. What we have here, as you probably noticed, we have a kind of families of protocols that has a very similar structure in the sense that they have this kind of structure of propose, vote, view merge technique. And if we think to implement, for example, view merge technique in LMD Ghost, then also LMD Ghost can be seen as having this kind of structure where we have a propose, vote, and merge phase. And the only difference with this family of protocol is the fork choice function, in the sense that we can have this kind of framework where we have this propose, vote, merge protocol, where we then characterize each single protocol through a fork choice function, in the sense that if we consider all the votes ever cast in the fork choice function, then we have LMD Ghost. If we consider votes cast in slot t minus 1, we have Goldfish. If we consider votes cast from slot t minus eta up to t minus 1, we obtain our LMD Ghost, in the sense that then what we can do is to have this kind of family. We can study properties of this family of protocol instantiated by a fork choice function, and we can derive then properties. Another thing that we have to take into consideration is the fact that we cannot just assume that in every slot, in every round, the majority of the participants that is online is honest, like for example, as it happens with LMD Ghost or as it happens in Goldfish. Here we need to take into account the fact that validators that were active in this range between t minus 8 and t minus 1 and that cast a vote in this range, could be that at slot t they might not be awake online at that point, meaning that the vote, even though it's unexpired, it's not up to date. Because of that, we need to require more assumption in the resiliency of the adversary, and we introduce this generalization of the tau sleepy model, which we call, of the sleepy model that we call tau sleepy model. Here, just some terminology that can be useful for to understand the equation that I'm going to show, where HT represents the set of all the active honest validators as slot T, AT represent the set of adversarial validators, and H with index S, comma T represent the honest validators that were active between slot S and slot T. We require that for some tau that goes from 1 to infinity, this equation should hold. Now, let's not focus on the indexes. The intuition here is that what we need to require is that at a slot T, the number of validators that are honest and active as slot T should exceed the number of adversarial validators, together with all the validators that has been active at some point, but that are not active anymore at slot T. In other ways, we need to reduce a bit the adversarial resiliency, in the sense that now, other than the adversary, we need to take into consideration also the validators that have been active at some point, but that are not active anymore. What we prove is that our protocol is dynamically available, or to be more precise, is tau dynamically available, meaning dynamically available in the tau sleepy model, and our LMD Ghost is eta dynamically available, in the sense that it's assuming eta, parameterized LMD Ghost with eta, this expiration period, and by considering eta sleepy model, then our protocol is eta dynamically available. Now, what we show is that we have this protocol that is dynamically available, and we can ask ourselves, but why we need to have this kind of protocol that has a worse adversarial resiliency than, for example, Goldfish? Well, the reason is that our protocol can, in some sense, tolerate some sort of asynchrony, where if we consider a temporary periods of asynchrony, where a period where we cannot guarantee any message delivery in the delta, then we say, first of all, that an execution with this kind of temporary period of asynchrony satisfies asynchrony resilience if any honest proposal from a slot before a period of asynchrony remains always in the canonical chain, meaning the chain output by the fork choice function, in all the validators that are awake before periods of asynchrony. Again, we say that an execution satisfies asynchrony resilience if all the honest proposals made before asynchrony always remain in the canonical chain of all the validators that are active before asynchrony. We proved that RLMD Ghost can resist periods of asynchrony of eta minus 1. The intuition here is that if we have an expiration period of messages of 2 slots, for example, and we have a period of asynchrony of one slot, it means that these messages will still be valid through all the periods of asynchrony, and after they can still be used to drive the right chain, meaning the chain that was canonical before period of asynchrony. Of course, here we need actually to add another assumption to the protocol, which is the following. I will just give the intuition here. The intuition is that we need to bound the joining rate of participants during asynchrony, in the sense that if you consider that before asynchrony we have 100 validators, but during asynchrony 2,000 validators join, these validators could be maliciously driven by a wrong chain. And of course, they will overwhelm the number of active participants before asynchrony, and then we lose everything. What we need to assume is basically that the number of honest validators before asynchrony should always exceed all the adversarial validators during asynchrony, together with all the participants that might join during asynchrony. In other terms, we need to limit the joining rate of participants during asynchrony. If this condition holds, which is a necessary condition, we have that our protocol resists periods of asynchrony of up to eta minus 1 slots. We have some limitations, and the most probably easy limitation that we can think is that, of course, if we parameterize our RLMD Ghost with an expiration period of 1 epoch, for example, and we have a period of asynchrony of 5 epochs, of course, we cannot guarantee anything, because throughout the periods of asynchrony, these messages will expire and then anything can happen. And so, yes, we have this protocol that in some sense, we can tolerate less adversary, because we need to take into account also some unexpired messages that are not cast by validators that are not online at slot T. But in turns, we have that if we can satisfy this condition, then we can also tolerate some unbounded periods of asynchrony. And we can guarantee safety to participants that are online before periods of asynchrony starts. So in some sense, we can give away some adversarial resiliency, but we can guarantee some sort of safety to some participants, those that are online before asynchrony. And so, yeah, it's a good thing. And future direction that actually either we already worked on or that we are currently working on are the following. One is to combine this RLMD Ghost with a partially synchronous component, and we did it. We obtained a protocol that is a secure ebb and flow protocol in the Tau-SLIPI model, and that you can find it at this QR code. We are also applying the same techniques, so with this Tau-SLIPI model with expiration period, also to deterministically safe consensus protocols. The protocols that I mentioned up to this point, they were probabilistically safe. We have also dynamically available deterministically safe protocols that make use of quorums, and we are applying these techniques also to these protocols. Actually, we already have some results that soon will be available. And another interesting thing is to investigate this asynchrony resilience for committee-based protocols, because in our case, as you remember, we do not make use of committees to prevent some problems. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Any questions for Luca? Yes, Dionysius.
Hello. So this model that you have for asynchrony resilience resembles a different model where you have a large delta delay, which upper bounds everything, but then you have a small delta, which is the responsiveness of the protocol. So how does this compare?
So in our case, we are not considered different deltas. It's true that what we could do is by increasing delta over time. Like if you don't receive messages, what you could do is to increase delta, to increase delta. In our case, we are using synchronized clocks, and we use the same assumption of delta. So participants, they proceed in slots. They know that slots are made by 3 delta rounds, and they keep going in this way. So the expiration period is set in a way to resist this kind of slot, but always by keeping the same delta. So that's the difference, in the sense that we don't keep increasing the delta, but we keep the same. And after asynchronous ends, we are still in the same delta bound assumption, meaning that the blocks, for example, they keep being 12 seconds, for example, forever. We are not increasing 12 seconds, 16, 20, or et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ling.
So since you already have the finality gadget to provide some sort of asynchrony tolerance, right, so can you comment on the advantage of building extra asynchrony tolerance into the underlying synchronous protocol as well?
Yes, because what could happen is that even if we have like an asynchronous safe, like a finality gadget on top, what could happen is that there might be a scenario where we might end up in conflicting chain in the available chain that might conflict with what has been finalized before, because finally what we can ensure is finality up to a certain point, but all the remaining part of the available chain that is not yet been finalized could end up in some sneaky scenario that, for example, with LMD Ghost can be shown, for example. So that's their intuition. To be more detailed, if you want, I can also show you later. But this is roughly the idea, that we want to preserve some sort of safety during asynchrony, because we don't want to end up in some scenarios where the available chain might be conflicting with something that has been previously.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So this is basically for faster confirmation, right?
Yes.
You're willing to wait 12.5 minutes.
Yes.
You don't need to worry about this, right?
No.
Okay. All right, one more question.
Is it possible that the timing of the delta cause like different? For example, if there's 2 validators, if I'm very close to you, then I receive your vote in time. However, another validator which was far away, when he received the vote, might be crossing that 2 delta time boundary. Would that be an issue?
So actually here, as I mentioned, we are considering synchronized clocks, meaning that every validator proceeds at the same speed. And what could happen is that our assumption implies that at every slot we have this kind of majority, right? So it could be that if I receive a vote, but you don't, anyway, for the way as the protocol is structured, we should end up in a way where the fork-shares function will output something that is not conflicting in case with what the other maybe hasn't received yet. So that's the
So kind of assume like a little bit like a global clock, right? Like
yes, yeah. I mean, yes, we
all
are.
the validators should see a global clock.
Yeah, exactly. Like we are assuming that all the validators proceed at the same speed, and this can be done easily because we know the genesis block, we know how much a slot lasts, we know that we are not increasing the delta over time if we don't receive messages, so they all proceed with the same speed, and we can assume this thing. Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have one question.
Sure.
Since there's no more question. So our paper, Ebb and Flow, that you mentioned,
Yes.
was motivated by this cap theorem. Yeah?
Yes, yes.
So that's a negative result.
Yes.
So a negative result motivates a positive construction.
Yes.
Now, you have a positive construction for this weaker notion of asynchronous resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a negative result that could sort of give some idea of whether your protocol is optimal in some sense, or maybe there are better protocols?
Well, I don't know if you refer to the possible limitations, but for example, the negative results here comes because we cannot tolerate any kind of asynchrony, right? We cannot tolerate any possible unbound, because otherwise there would violate the impossibility result.
Yes.
So what we can do is to sort of tuning these parameters in the sense that how much asynchrony we could expect.
Exactly.
And how much also, because we cannot say let's tolerate, I'm just making up, 20 epoch of asynchrony, because in that case the adversarial resiliency would be so little that we couldn't probably tolerate anything. So here, a challenging thing that we need to understand is how to fine-tuning the parameters, how much asynchrony we could tolerate, but how much adversary are we willing to tolerate. So that's probably the negative result in this point of view, that we cannot just tolerate any kind of, because if that was the case, then we would violate the impossibility result. So here what we wanted to do is to say, can we in some sense gain back some sort of safety in case of asynchrony? And this is what we...
Yeah, I guess my question was, you're reducing you have some asynchrony tolerance, but at the same time you're weakening the dynamic availability resilience.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether there's a negative result which governed that trade-off.
I see. Yeah, I think it could be, it's
That would
worth
be
to
interesting,
investigate.
right? To see whether the protocol is optimal for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll give thanks to not only Luca, but all our speakers for the session. Excellent section. Thank you very much, everybody. So that's the end of the session.